Okay, in this little quick 5 minute excerpt, I'm going to deal with the questions about presidential campaigns and choosing presidential candidates. So when people start trying to run for office, or they're starting to figure out if they're going to run for their party's nomination for president of the United States, they go through something called the invisible primary, and this is when you start seeing people write books and they start doing Sunday morning interviews. They go to New Hampshire and Iowa, and things like that to do interviews and give speeches, and you're like, well, why is Nikki Haley, the former governor of South Carolina and UN ambassador, giving a speech in Iowa? Well, it's because she's trying to figure out if there's support enough for her to run for president. She's the only person who's declared to run for president so far in the Republican Party who appears like they're going to challenge Trump, because Trump has announced he's going to run. Nikki Haley's the only other person in the Republican Party so far who's announced they're going to run. So you go through this thing called the invisible primary, and those are when the problems with your candidacy are supposed to emerge. It is the job of the parties to vet candidates, because if you put up somebody who's going to be controversial or is guaranteed to lose, your party's going to lose. So the parties are supposed to serve as sort of gatekeepers to prevent people who shouldn't be president from becoming president. But for the most part, those very simple qualifications that you see in the Constitution: 35 years old, 14-year resident, natural born citizen. There is nothing that says they must be moral, they must be a good person, they must be highly educated. If the American people are willing to nominate a person, there's not a lot holding them back from being a candidate. And that's something a lot of people don't think about. Secondly, I got a really good question about what's the difference between primaries and caucuses. Um, Caucuses are much more of an investment and have a tendency to skew the results. And what I mean by that is, um, caucuses are a whole evening. Like when you go to caucus, first of all, it's way less formal than primaries are. So when you go to a caucus, you're going to walk into a gymnasium, a church, multi-purpose room or whatever, and they're going to have their little precinct or their little caucus session, and you're going to have people who are advocating for each candidate, who stand up and give a speech, because they're trying to persuade you, and then it can take hours to do this. It's much more of an investment, which also means that it skews the people who come out, because the people who go to caucus are going to be the more politically motivated, while the general public isn't going to be as invested. They're not going to be as passionate. So you may not be getting an accurate representation. Also, primaries are much more formal. You go in, and when you go and vote in a primary process, it's going to look very similar to the day you actually go for the federal election to vote. You're going to go in, you're going to show your identification, you're going to show that you can vote in that precinct, and then you're going to go. They're going to take your information, and you're going to go get your little digital card or whatever it is in the state that you're at. You're going to go put it into the machine. They're going to record your vote. In caucuses, there can be show of hands. Things can be determined by putting beans in a jar, paper ballots, all kinds of crazy things go on at less formal things, I should say, go on during caucus sessions than they do during primaries. And so that's really one of the biggest differences. And only about a fifth of registered voters show up for caucuses. You get a little bit better than that during primaries, although depending on what election cycle it is, some election cycles, especially midterm elections, can have really dismal turnouts. And that's not a good thing either, because what happens when you have dismal turnouts is you do not get a proper representation of what the general public wants. You get a section of probably the more passionate voters that doesn't really reflect necessarily what everybody wants and what's better for everybody. Okay, another question I've got a couple of these about term limits on presidents. So after Roosevelt served he was elected to 4 terms, we passed something called the 22nd Amendment, which limits a president to somebody can only get elected to the presidency for 2 4-year terms. They do not have to be consecutive. They can be separated, but only 2 4-year terms. And do I think this is enough time? I think, especially now with how, presidents used to be presidents, and what I mean by that is, like, they were the president. When they signed things into law, you heard about them. When something happened or they gave a speech, you heard about them. There wasn't this perpetual, nonstop analysis about everything all the time. People got their news twice a day. If that, they got their newspaper, and then maybe they watched the evening news they had 4 channels to choose from. And all of those channels were much more geared towards just reporting facts and news than providing interpretation. That's one of the big differences in what's going on now is that now there's a million different platforms. Everything's about clickbait, meaning that people are trying to get ratings. They're trying to stimulate people to get them excited or make them angry. And unfortunately, human beings really respond to negativity in an incredibly strong way. And so that's created, people aren't just reporting facts anymore. They are interpreting things for you, or they're providing the edge, or they're trying to be first. And it's led to a lot of lack of inaccuracy. It's led to the rise of personality cults. Now, people have always been attached to their news anchors, Walter Cronkite, Peter Jennings, people like that, Ted Koppel. Yes, absolutely. But Ted Koppel he wasn't making more money when you clicked on his articles or his Facebook page or his Instagram page or his Twitter page, or, but that has a lot to do with what drives revenue, your YouTube channel subscriptions, how many clicks you're getting. Nobody wants to click on a story about somebody doing volunteer work. They want to click on the story about the, 5-car pileup. And that's an unfortunate aspect of human nature, but in reality, what that really is doing is it's driving our news coverage towards the negative. It's sensationalizing everything. There are documented stories about, like, when President Kennedy was president. The media was aware of his infidelities and how much he would, was unfaithful in his marriage and things like that. But that didn't get widely reported because reporters back then wanted to sort of protect the office of the presidency, and it wasn't going to do the American public good to know that their president was having as many relationships as he was having, that he, was married, and the public wouldn't feel that he should have been having. But they wanted to protect the office of the presidency. Now, because of how money-driven and partisan our politics are, that's not the case anymore. If they found out something about Joe Biden, they would publish it in a second. If the media found out something about Donald Trump, they would publish it in a second, because they're not worried about protecting the sanctity of the office. They're worried about getting ratings, and they're worried about getting revenue, and revenue controls all. If you want a real world perfect example of this, if the facts and the testimony in the Dominion lawsuit against Fox News ends up being true, we basically have quotes, texts, and emails proving that Fox News embraced election conspiracy lies in the name of improving their ratings. Because right after the election, when they tried to tell what they viewed and knew to be the truth, their ratings went down and they started losing viewers. And it appears, according to their own text messages, the head of Fox News essentially said, our viewers don't like it. And they all of a sudden started bringing election conspiracy people on air, and their ratings went back up. So that's a whole different conversation for when we talk about the media, but great question in that regard. Also, just to kind of add on top of that, there was another question about what role does money play in presidential politics, and that cannot even be calculated. It is so substantial at this point. You're going to hear, and you hopefully have read at this point, about Citizens United, and what Citizens United did, despite all the noise, what it did is it essentially allowed for the creation of something called super PACs. And that means that billionaires and corporations can form something called a super PAC, and they can influence campaigns through media, donations, and things like that. Now, there are rules about where that money exactly can go, but the overall influence is really the same, that they're able to essentially advocate politically for what they want. And so since 2010, things have really changed, and money, while it's always played a role in politics since the beginning of time, since we've had politics, money has always played some sort of a role. But because of social media, media in general, not just social media, the influence of things like Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and stuff, media advertisements on television, when you have billions of dollars and you want to defeat a candidate, there are now multiple legal routes for you to be able to organize and deploy those resources towards a political gain, which is something that's relatively new over the last 12 years, especially on the scale that it's been involved.